Well, Congressman Sean Casten, we just spoke to you earlier in the month, but my goodness, so much has happened since then. Congressman Sean Casten, of course, represents the 6th District of Illinois and is a member of the House Committee on the Climate Crisis and House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, where he serves on the subcommittees for energy, environment, and investigation and oversight, and attended COP26. Congressman Casten, welcome back to the Climate Pod.
Nice to see you guys again.
It's great to see you. Let's start with, again, so much has happened. Let's start with COP26. You attended COP26 along with a delegation of congresspeople from the United States. What kind of reception did the American delegation receive in Glasgow?
You know, it was so fascinating. I think when we talked last time, it mentioned that, when we were in Madrid, I think I shared the story that someone pulled me aside and said, bad things happen when the US doesn't lead, and we need you to lead. And that, of course, was in the context of the former guy being the president and all these sort of, just wave after wave of environmental rollbacks. And I don't give a what-ism that informed the environmental policy of the prior administration. And, we were treated this time in some ways sort of like conquering heroes. They were so grateful to have us there. We had a bigger delegation. We, of course, were actually with members of the executive branch this time, Gina McCarthy, John Kerry. Barack Obama stopped in to say hello. Joe Biden, of course, was there, and Administrator Reagan. But at the same time, there was a little bit of skepticism. And you sort of realize that Europeans watch our politics very closely, that we are this ridiculous outlier. I think we're the only country in the world where one major party thinks that you can out-muscle physics with enough political rhetoric. And so we got a lot of questions where they said, we're delighted with what you're doing. It's great to hear you've made all these commitments. But, oh, by the way, what happens if you lose control of the House? Where is Senator Manchin on this? If you lose control of the presidency in this cycle, will you go back again? Because these are folks who've been involved in these climate conversations for a long time. They saw George W. Bush pull out of Kyoto. They saw Trump pull out of Paris. And so they're delighted that we're there, but they're still waiting to see, can I trust you to stay there or not? Which was, as an American, a little unsettling.
Yeah, I think, obviously it came out of the conference with this Glasgow Climate Pact. What was your biggest takeaways from COP26?
Oh, boy, I'm going to get real nerdy on this one. The single biggest thing that I was focused on was Article 6. As I'm sure you are also Article 6 nerds like me. This is this really important thing that we finally seem to have some framework on, which is that if all the countries in the world pledge to reduce their emissions by some known amount, I'll do 100 million tons, you do 200 million tons, et cetera, are those numbers additive? And that's kind of an important thing to know, right? Are we going to get to zero CO2? Well, to answer that question, you have to solve this accounting issue, because if I make wind power in my country and then I sell that electricity across the border to your country and you make steel, which one of us gets to claim the CO2 reduction? And as you might imagine, different countries have very different incentives on how we'll do that accounting. But there was an agreement to standardize that accounting, which was really big. A huge show of private sector financial resources, especially from U.S. banks, trillions of dollars committed to both make investments in clean energy in the developing world and to help mitigate some of the damages caused by climate change, which was a big deal. And then I think probably one of the most near-term impactful and under-heralded was this global methane pledge to slash methane emissions. The amount of methane that was committed to be reduced to in COP has the greenhouse gas equivalent of taking every car, bus, truck, airplane, ship off the road. And that may sound implausible, but methane is 84 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2 is. So you get a huge leverage point, and it's really the only way that we avoid irreversibility to do that. So that was a pretty big deal as well. Now, of course, we've all got to go back to our home countries where we actually have legislative authority and pass the binding rules to affirm these, non-binding but appropriately aspirational international commitments.
And, when you got back from COP26, that the House and Congress started passing legislation, right? They, since we last talked, Congress passed and President Biden signed the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. Now, this is not the climate bill that everyone has been hoping for, but it did contain some spending measures that would help America mitigate and adapt. So, what were the elements of the infrastructure bill that did address the climate crisis?
So I got to start with the personal pieces that were the bills that I'd written and got in there. I was pretty excited about it. The first was the Clean Industrial Technology Act, which is a provision to build $500 million out to figure out how to decarbonize the hard to decarbonize industries. And we have to do that because if we're going to get to zero CO2, we got to figure out how to make fertilizer without natural gas. We got to figure out how to make steel without metallurgical coke, how to make silicon without metallurgical coke, how to make cement without coal, right? Because if you don't know the answer to those questions, then you don't know how to put a silicon solar panel on a concrete pad and say it's zero carbon, right? So that's in there. That's an R&D and development program. The second one of ours was it was called the BEST Act. It was $1 billion program that myself and Bill Foster had two bills stitched together, but really to create and deploy technologies for grid level energy storage. Hugely important because as we move to renewable sources that are more intermittent, we need some kind of technology to absorb the electricity when they've got more than we need and discharge it when we've got less. Some really cool technologies coming out of Argonne Lab, where I live out here. And so some good potential, $1 billion for that. The other climate provisions, and you're right, most of the climate provisions are in the Build Back Better that's passed the House we have to get through. But there's a fairly significant amount of money both for transmission build out and for electric vehicle charging build out, both of which are going to be critical because if we're going to decarbonize, we really have to electrify a lot of our vehicle fleet, which means that we have to make it affordable for people to own electric vehicles, charge electric vehicles, and then make sure that we have the grid distribution infrastructure to get the power from those new clean generators we're building to those new charging stations we're building, which are not necessarily going to be right where the loads are right now. So that stuff is pretty big. It's not enough. The really big stuff is in Build Back Better, but was nice to be on the White House lawn with the president and see that signed into law.
Yeah, and the Build Back Better Act did get passed by the House. It's now sitting in the Senate, and it does, like you said, a lot more to address the climate crisis. So what are some of the biggest steps you think this legislation will make on addressing the climate crisis?
So I think what the Build Back Better Act recognizes that we too often forget is that clean energy is cheaper than dirty energy. The challenge isn't, if you have a solar panel on the roof of your house, you don't sit around and say, darn it, I wish I didn't have this expensive solar electricity feeding into my socket, right? You're pretty psyched, it's free. The question is, how do you get the money to put it on the roof of your house, right? And that's not fundamentally different from saying, how do you get the money to build a coal plant? It's just that in the case of the coal plant, you're left with an asset that's really expensive to operate. And when you build a solar panel, you have an asset that's really cheap to operate. So how do we build it? And so there are a whole lot of various tax incentives, not just for solar, but for solar, for wind, for building efficiency, for electric vehicles, all these things to make it possible for people to build the things that we need to have a cheaper energy system. And once that stuff is built, it runs and it competes the dickens out of all the other stuff, and we green up the system pretty quickly. So that's pretty great. There are similar provisions on electric vehicles, which are, it's interesting, the difference, and this is maybe a sad statement on the nature of bipartisanship in this kind of country. The electric vehicle provisions in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill that was signed by the president and passed both houses basically provide a lot of money to put electric vehicle charging stations on our nation's highways. That's terrific. It's really good if you're going on a trip to have a place to charge. It's kind of useless if you rent your home, because where are you going to charge it at night? Or if you don't have a garage, right? And the fact that we had to go to the partisan bill to say, let's create incentives so that for people who rent, for people who don't have attached garages, create some incentives for those folks to actually also be able to avail themselves of this really cool, really low cost technology of the future, and not only provide that to the wealthy among us. And so there's a lot of provisions there to sort of expand that infrastructure to also include, more urban areas, to put it, simply. So those are probably the big muscle moment pieces. But oh, by the way, there is also this other really important thing, and it ties back to what I said is the unheralded piece of Glasgow. We have a big methane fee program in here. And we've got to keep that in on the Senate side. But part of the reason why I keep saying this is so important is that if you read the IPCC report, you don't have to read it that closely. It says that if we get over 1.5 degrees of warming, we will hit irreversible changes. And then it says we're at 2 degrees of warming. We have already overshot. Now, you're a little bit farther and it says actually only feels like 1.1 degrees of warming because we've also injected all this soot into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, which creates sort of a temporary cooling blanket. It's not the smartest way to cool the planet, but it's the way we're doing it. That's going to come out in the fairly short term. CO2 lasts for a long time. Soot doesn't last for very long. Methane lasts for about 10 years in the atmosphere, and then it breaks down to CO2. So if we can cut the methane quickly, that has the effect. There's nothing we can do that has a bigger and more immediate impact at A, cooling the planet, and B, making sure that we don't in fact sail into these completely irreversible positions. Because otherwise, the floods, the fires, the hurricanes, the melting ice caps, the rising sea levels, that's not our new normal. It's the rate of change that's our new normal. And if that doesn't scare the dickens out of you, you're not paying attention.
So how does the Build Back Better Act help us hit some of the climate goals that President Biden ran on?
Well, so, to go to things I had before, like, so let's say that you want to buy an electric vehicle. You'd love to not have to pay for gasoline anymore, but you can't come up with, I don't know, if you buy what's a Tesla 3 run nowadays, $40,000 or so. Maybe you can't come up with $40,000. Well, good news. There's a $7,000 tax credit for you to buy that vehicle in this bill. And if you buy it from a company that allows a unionized workforce, it's a $12,000 tax credit. That starts to really change the calculus of who can afford that. We also did this nice thing, which I think is long overdue, of saying that even though we're structuring this as a tax credit, we'll make it refundable. So what we want you to do is to buy an electric vehicle or to put a solar panel on your house or insulate your home. But if you don't have a bunch of income this year, you can still capture that money and lower the cost of your vehicle. So, much as that when we made the child tax credit refundable, I don't know if you guys have kids or not, but you got a check. You didn't have to wait to go take a deduction on your tax return next year. You got an immediate check that said cost the federal government the same amount, right? Mm-hmm. We just said we're going to give this to people regardless of their tax status. And so we put those incentives in there, and that refundability is for upgrades you might do for efficiency in your home, putting solar panels on your roof, et cetera, et cetera. So those are really the very big pieces of what's in there. There's also a lot for R&D. There's a lot for incentivizing more agricultural practices that will incentivize soil carbon retention. I could go on and get wonky, but these are big deals.
The president loves to talk about soil carbon retention. So that's a really cool thing. Your work's done here. The House did their job. How confident are you that this is going to pass the Senate?
Oh, there's so much of my job that consists of, looking over to the Senate side and trying to see if the parliamentarian is releasing a black or white puff of smoke today. We've got to get through the parliamentary traps, which is so goofy, right? I mean, our founders didn't want to filibuster. They didn't want supermajority control, but the Senate's created one. And so now we have these goofy rules for budgetary reasons. So we've got to go through the parliamentary tap. I'm confident that we will pass something very close to the Build Back Better out of the Senate. Yeah, what it will take to get, the couple recalcitrant Democratic senators on board, it'll take something. I don't know what they'll have to give. The tragedy, though, because we can spend a lot of time talking about a certain senator from West Virginia and a certain senator from Arizona, but I would submit to you that we don't spend nearly enough time talking about the fact that 50% of the United States Senate just doesn't give a damn. Mm-hmm. Right? You got 50 people who are sitting there saying, I see the West is on fire. I see that New Orleans is getting hit. They barely recovered from one storm before they get smacked with another. I see that we had $100 billion in property damages from climate change last year. And you know what I think we should do? Not a damn thing. That's tragic,
Yeah.
right? Why is this partisan? So as long as that's the case, we've got to worry about one or two Democratic senators to get this across the line.
Do you think to get it across the line that will take major changes to the bill?
I hope not. I'm not hearing anything very noisy about the tax credits. There's been some noise that Senator Manchin would like to take away the premium for union-made vehicles. I don't totally understand that. I think the workers in West Virginia have just as much right to form a union and protect themselves as anybody else. And so I hope we don't take that away. At the same time, if it comes back to House and says you got everything in here, but we don't have an extra $5,000 to incentivize union-made vehicles, it's a worse bill. Make no mistake. It's worse for our working people, but it's still worth signing.
Yeah.
The other piece that I think we've got to just stay hyper vigilant on at the end is this whole methane fee. When we had the oil and gas folks testifying before the oversight committee, and I waved on the committee for it, I asked them, I said, can you just agree with me that methane is 84 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2 is? Because you guys employ a lot of chemical engineers. This is just chemistry. Well, it's hard to say. I can't really say that. If it's 84 times as potent, and it's over the course of 30 years, it's 30 times as potent because it converts to CO2. That means if you have a 3% loss from the wellhead to the burner tip, you get natural gas, which is a much cleaner fuel than coal. You pump it all the way through. If you lose just 3% of it from the valves and the pipes and the gaskets, you're actually worse than coal from a greenhouse gas perspective. And I said, will you at least go on the record and acknowledge that your distribution system is not completely free of leaks? Well, we're fighting to make that better. And you sit there and say, come on, guys. You're in the business of giving people access to energy. That's a noble calling. You're not in the business of pissing in the river. Can you just acknowledge that releasing pollutants into the atmosphere that makes us sicker, that warms the planet, that's a bad thing? We shouldn't do it, and it's appropriate for government to penalize that. We couldn't get it, so I think we're going to see a lot of lobbying from them to try to strip those provisions, and we just got to stay vigilant to keep them in there.
My biggest worry right now is that all of the media coverage and talk about inflation, and I don't want to completely diminish those fears. I mean, there's price pressures on people. They're very real, but that all of the talk on inflation will undercut the appetite for the American people and like specifically people in the Senate to act on climate. As we know, we cannot wait to act on climate. This is a crisis. This is an emergency. But how do you think, how could this bill in fact affect something like inflation?
Well, to some degree, I think it's telling that my colleagues across the aisle, when we're asked, do you think prescription drugs are too cheap or too expensive? Do you think that, childcare is too affordable and too ubiquitous or needs more of it? Do you think that people should have an equal opportunity even if they're, not old enough for public school? Their answer is, well, have you seen what the price of gas is? There's a reason they're changing the subject, right? These are very, very popular programs that they'd like to get done. The issues with inflation are very real. They also are largely not really a function of policy choices, not a function of fiscal policy choices we've made recently. And I say that, number one, as someone who sits on the Financial Services Committee and has the luxury of, picking Chairman Powell's brain once a quarter or so. But also, having spent a lot of time in the energy industry, you look at what's driving the higher price of gasoline. An awful lot of it is because of the Texas freeze. You saw this huge collapse in refinery capacity, and you look at the amount of gasoline going through U.S. refineries right now, and it's way below historic averages. We're in a supply constrained world, not a demand constrained world right now that's pushing up the price. And if this was a fiscal matter of people spending a lot more money, you'd see a surge in demand for gasoline, right? What we're actually seeing is a constraint in supply. The other reason we're seeing a constraint in supply is because because of the fracking revolution, the U.S. has gone from a net importer of petroleum products to a net exporter. And that means that even when prices fall in the United States, a lot of producers have an incentive to sell overseas if there's a higher price over there. So, and we've seen that in natural gas as well, a huge surge in exports. And so we're seeing sort of a coupling with international markets and ties over there that aren't here. Those sorts of things, if you spend any time studying energy markets, they're cyclical and they bounce back and forth all the time. My dad used to have a little paperweight on his desk of an oil barrel. And on one side it said, relax, the price will go up. And on the other side it said, relax, the price will go down. It will happen. So I think those things are going to wash through. The other reason why I said that I'm not really so concerned that on the fiscal side it matters is because the Chair Powell and the folks at the Federal Reserve are really, really smart people. Because of all of the very unconventional financial tools they've deployed over the last 15 years, buying bonds, quantitative easing, all that stuff Ben Bernanke came up with, they are sitting on a massive amount of ammunition that they could use to tamp down inflation if it were structural, right? All they have to do is ease back the bond purchases, and you'd see a pickup in interest rates. That pickup in interest rates would then slow the rate of growth of the economy. And that's the tool that if you thought that the economy was overheating right now because there was so much demand, that would be the right and prudent thing for the Federal Reserve to do. It's telling that they're not doing it. Right. So let's make sure that we're continuing to look out for folks who have need. Make sure that, wouldn't we love to be in the world where demand was overheating? We're not there right now, but let's get that. And then, oh, by the way, if we can get a bunch of women access to childcare, that means a lot of women can go back into the workforce, which is going to ease some of the pressures we see on wages, which is driving up inflation. That's in the Build Back Better Act. If we can increase the supply of affordable housing, which there's $60 billion that in the Affordable Care Act, or the Affordable Care Act, the Build Back Better Act, $60 billion of affordable housing. Well, if we can increase the supply of housing, that means we ease some of the pressure on housing prices, which should ease inflation, right? So there's a lot of these sort of the places where we do have demand pressure, we're taking steps to increase supply to match.
Well, whenever we see any kind of social spending programs like this, like the bill consists of, the deficit hawks always seem to come out of the woodwork. And we're seeing this now, obviously. And this bill does have pay-fors. So how will this bill be paid for to address the concerns of those deficit hawks?
Thank you so much for saying that, Ty, because I've lost track of how many times I've had to say to people like, I'm just more concerned about the debt than you are. I say, no, that's great news because this is fully paid for, no debt. You'll be so happy. I look forward to your vote. It never works, but it's worth saying. So there are, the president stuck true to his word that no one earning less than $400,000 will see an increase in their taxes. So there are some increase in the very high marginal, very higher incomes marginal tax rates that are some of the pay-fors. There are some really very, I think, clever pieces around international tax harmonization, because a whole lot of companies have managed to declare their profits in a country with low tax rates, not where they do their activity, just where they declare their profits. And so there's this commitment, both within the law that it's called the guilty provisions that I won't get into, it's complicated, but then stapled to that is a lot of international negotiations with the OECD countries to basically establish a global minimum tax rate to make sure that we don't have this sort of rush of profits overseas just to dodge. That's a meaningful issue. Two of the biggest pay-fors, and I think their value is vastly more than the Congressional Budget Office has scored them. The first is giving Medicare the right to negotiate drug prices and making sure that we keep the price of insulin at no more than $35 a month. That's a huge deal for an awful lot of people. It's a huge deal for a lot of seniors, but it's also a huge deal for the taxpayer, because Medicare pays way too much money for drugs. And so when we lower the price of drugs, that actually is a pay for that helps offset some of these other pieces, and a really big deal. The one that is completely enormous, and it's depressing what a big deal this is giving money to the IRS to, tell me if you've heard this before, enforce the laws we already have. Have you ever heard anybody make that argument? The Trump appointed head of the IRS told us that the tax gap, that is the difference between taxes that are due to the United States under current law and taxes that are paid to the United States under current law, is $1 trillion a year.
Wow.
This is a 10-year budget window, right? So if we just enforced the laws on the books, we would generate $10 trillion of money to pay for this $1.75 trillion bill. And the even bigger tragedy of that is that the higher your income, the less likely you are to be audited, because lower income people have simpler tax returns, and the IRS has been so starved for resources so long that they just prioritize the simple cases. So we've got money in there to the IRS. The CBO only scored over 10 years that would generate less than $200 billion of revenue. So $1 trillion a year, and they're saying over 20 years to only generate $200 billion revenue. The reason why they said that is because the IRS has been so underfunded for so long, understaffed for people, understaffed for IT hardware, that they basically took a very conservative view on how long it's going to take to restore them to the having the resources they need to get this done. Now, I'm hoping we can do way better than that, but we're talking, again, 200 billion, little less than 200 billion versus 10 trillion. Like, we don't have to be, that's, it's not inconceivable that could be twice as big, right? And that's a huge deficit reduction method. I started this by saying we should enforce the laws we already have. You know what else we should do? We should fund the police, because the IRS are the white collar police. let's do that.
Let's just wrap up here. I mean, obviously, a lot's going to depend on whether the bill passes the Senate and what's actually in the final bill. But do you expect Congress to pass additional legislation to address climate during this presidential term?
I sure hope so. I mean, this bill, much like COP, frankly, this will be the biggest climate bill that we have ever passed in Congress, just as COP was the biggest commitment ever made internationally to address climate, and neither of them are sufficient. Right? So we've got to keep pushing through. I personally think that I'm hard pressed to see us doing anything at this level of ambition going forward from the legislative branch, but I'm really, really encouraged about what might be happening at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. As I think I'm a FERC nerd. Pushed hard to make FERC bring sexy back to FERC with hot FERC summer. But that was really about getting a fifth commissioner appointed, because FERC had been stuck on all these 2-2 decisions. FERC is the person who regulates our federal energy system, and they're the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is their name. They now have Willie Phillips nominated and confirmed. And I'm going to take all credit for that. It's only because I had so much noise about hot FERC summer. But they're now at a point where they're going to have to make some decisions in very short order about where do we build the transmission lines to make sure that all this new renewable energy we're building can actually get access to markets. Who's going to pay for those lines? How are we going to permit them? And who's going to inject them? Well, once those decisions are made, you can start building the lines. And now all of a sudden we can really start capitalizing on all of this zero carbon generation that's also zero cost generation. It's going to put competitive pressure to drive the other dirty stuff out of the market. They've got some separate proceedings that I've been pushing on for really since I got to Congress. That is, we build all of this zero cost generation. We're driving the cost of power down so low that investors are losing the investment incentive to build a new power plant. Mm-hmm. If you watch some of the drama in Ohio or Illinois over the nuclear fleet over the last 6 months, you've got these nuclear operators saying, I can't justify the investment in a new fueling cycle, even though I have such a low cost generator, because the rates are too low that I'm going to earn in wholesale markets. That pressure that the nuclear industry is seeing is soon to hit the wind and solar and geothermal and a lot of other industries. And FERC has the authority to fix that, because they're the only entity responsible with the jurisdiction to affect wholesale market rate design. And I think a very compelling case can be made that in the name of keeping the lights on, FERC has to provide a differential reward to generators that have the smallest externality cost on the rest of
Right.
society, which is a complicated regulatory way of saying they could impose a carbon price, right? And you could argue that they have to.
Mhm.
And so I think some of those discussions are coming through FERC, and they don't have to be mediated by Congress. But I think Congress might have the ability to do some things to nudge them in that direction and basically remind them of, maybe close some gaps between where they have the authority and where they might debate whether they have the obligation. And I think Congress could do some sort of surgical things in that vein to close that gap and give them the obligation on things they already have the authority for.
We'll continue to monitor it. Congressman Casten, we could talk to you every single week on this podcast, but you're busy passing landmark legislation, so we will let you get back to it. But thank you so much for all your time this year. And thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Hey, always a pleasure. Thanks so much, guys.